all bureaucracies are resistant to change. Why is it that you're seeking the change? When you look at the four key elements in the quadrangle of how we look at life or the various ways in which we approach life, at the highest pedestal is the idea of moksha, which is salvation.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode. Today we have with us a maverick in the field of military strategy and counterterrorism, Colonel Vivek Chadha, who served in the Indian Army for the past 2 decades and is now a senior research fellow at IDSA. Today's conversation is about his latest book, Even If It Ain't Broke, Do Fix It, which talks about embracing change. Let's hear more on it from him. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
So to begin with, would you like to introduce the audience with the book?
There is a saying which says that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I turned it on its head because I felt that for organizations like the Indian Army, you don't really get to know when an organization needs change. And if you go by the original adage, then you are really opposing change in every single manner. So the intent was that there is a need for change which is consistent. Like we do say that the only constant is change. And if the only constant is change, organizations do need to evolve over a period of time. And this change could be evolutionary, it could be revolutionary. So I look at all these issues in the context of the Indian Army, and both in terms of the conventional role of the Indian Army, that is state on state conflict, as well as the sub-conventional role of the Indian Army, where you're looking primarily at issues related to countering terrorism. So I felt that we needed to look at the entire issue of change management within the Indian Army, and that change management, despite the fact that a lot of people might feel that everything is perfect and we don't need to change, I felt there is always a need to change. There is always better that you can do with any organization, and that was the seeding thought that led to this book.
If you think about the military at the moment, what aspects do you think requires change in terms of maybe the technological advancements that are coming in, or personal power, or whatever? What do you think needs change in the Indian Army?
One of the biggest changes that we have seen post-independence is currently on. You have the restructuring of the armed forces that is underway, not only the army, but the armed forces in general. You had in 2019 the Office of the Chief of Defence Staff that was created, the Department of Military Affairs that was created. The government is in the process of undertaking the creation of theatre commands in the near future. So there's major restructuring of the armed forces going on, and by all accounts, if you look at the post-independence period, these are probably the most profound structural changes that are going to take place. And these structural changes don't happen in isolation. Along with the structural changes come changes in the military culture.
Right.
How you interact with each other, how the three principal organs of the military, that is the Army, Navy and Air Force, will be functioning with each other and as also with the apex higher defense organizations in the country. And when that happens, the life of every soldier, every combatant, every airman, every sailor is bound to change as well. Mm-hmm. Because you're no longer going to get confined within your service related environment. You will look at things beyond that as well. A lot of organizations will become tri-service. For example, your logistics over a period of time will become tri-service. Your training organizations, a lot of them will become tri-service. Training establishments which will, of let's say the aviation kind, which will provide training to all of them. You spoke of technology, the induction of technology, which was service specific in many ways till now, will become tri-services, which will bring in economies of scale, greater efficiency. You often talk about the issue of artificial intelligence, cyber, blockchain. These are all issues that are going to come in a major way, and they have been dealt with, of course, to an extent in the book as well, mm-hmm. as to how they're likely to have an impact on the future of the armed forces, and in terms of how we can bring in greater efficiencies and effectiveness.
So when you talk about change, there's a lot of discomfort involved in the process. Either could be for an individual or an institution or organization. How do you suggest an individual and an institution should embrace that discomfort in order to grow and in order to make changes in their...
So you're absolutely right. It's said that all bureaucracies are resistant to change. Mm-hmm. And the uniform bureaucracy, as we call it, because bureaucracy is everywhere. It's not that the armed forces don't have bureaucracy. So the uniform bureaucracy is most resistant to change. So that's a very, very apt question, because unless you go about a very considered approach to change management, you will find that the resistance is going to be intense. The changes that are initiated will remain limited to the period that the initiators are in command, are in control of a certain period of time, and thereafter they tend to slip back in time, which is why there are some essentials of successful change. In the case of the armed forces, I would say that the most important factor is that the change should ideally be owned and driven by the political elite. Any major change, and especially when we talk of change, I'm here referring to major changes, the kind of restructuring, for example, that I spoke about. So if you look at the restructuring exercise, there is very little doubt in my mind that it is owned and driven by the government. It was announced by the Prime Minister on 15th of August, and it came as a surprise to a lot of people, even within the armed forces, because they were not expecting, for example, the creation of a CDS. A lot of people were talking of a watered down appointment in terms of a permanent chairman of the Chief of Staff Committee. But there was a political elite which felt that they could take this step, and they were very clear in terms of what they wanted to achieve with it, and they went ahead with it. Similarly, nobody was talking about the Department of Military Affairs, but it was the political elite, along with their advisors who gave them advice on these affairs, who felt that there was a requirement of bringing the military into the decision making loop, and that only happens when you part of the government structure. So the Department of Military Affairs came in. So here was an example where the political establishment drove that change. It was very much a part of that change.
Right.
Now when that happens, you know that the change is coming from the very top, which makes it far easier to implement that change. Along with that comes an integration of professional advice, professional guidance, because the political elite can take the decision. They can give you the broad parameters, but who is going to give the necessary political acumen to this change to make sure that it succeeds? That comes from the senior hierarchy of the armed forces, and that's exactly where they have stepped in and are designing the nature of that structure that is going to come about. Right. So that is the second level. The third and a very important level is that there has to be continuity of this change. It can't be personality oriented. It can't only be led by an individual and thereafter the day he retires, that is the end of the change. So that is a very, very important factor. The fourth factor is that any change that you bring about must be done with a very clear strategic foresight. If that foresight is not there, then that change will not be able to take the vagaries of time, of circumstances, of events in the future. And I think the fifth and a very important factor again is that over a period of time, you need to reevaluate whatever changes that you are attempting to bring in, and any shifts or modifications or change in your roadmap that is required should be possible, should be feasible, and one should not be dogmatic with the initial ideas. You can't say, look, this is what initially, look at the constitution. It came in as a certain document and it's undergone a number of changes because times change, requirements change, events change, you can't foresee everything. So that again should be built in into the change management process. So these are these 5 critical principles which ensure successful change management.
So these 5 were majorly for an institution or organization.
These are true actually not only for the armed forces. You'll see that if you look at these 5 broad principles, it may not be the political establishment in the case of a private company, but certainly the decision-making elite. So these are valid actually elsewhere as well.
Through these aspects that you spoke about, could you give some tips for individuals who are seeking change and for their growth, and how can they, what can the process that they should cater to?
So I feel, the first question that you need to ask yourself, which is as true for institutional change as it is for an individual, why is it that you're seeking the change? Unless you can truly answer that question, you will be undertaking change either on a whim or because it's fashionable.
Right.
So you have to be very clear in your heart as to why is that change required. Okay, I feel that my routine needs to change But why does my routine need to change? Is it because it's going to make me healthier? Is it because it's going to bring down my stress levels? Is it because it's going to enhance my efficiency? Whatever be the reason, but I need to be clear as to why that change needs to come about. Once I'm clear about that, then I can go about cutting down certain things, adding certain things, or altering certain things.
Okay.
So that must be clear to begin with, and then comes your next step of how do you do it. So the how must always come after the why, right? And then what are the ingredients that are required to make sure that it's a smooth implementation process.
So the most important thing you are saying is the motivation to change.
Yes.
People have the motivation to change. For instance, let's say someone has a motivation to change, but how do you keep the discipline to embrace the change and continue in doing what you're trying to do?
I think if the motivation to change exists, and if it's really something you're convinced about, then the motivation to remain consistent with it will automatically come. If you are yourself not convinced about the change, there cannot be motivation.
Correct. So would you say that change is synonym to growth in some ways?
Ideally, it should be. Ideally, that's exactly what it is meant to be. It's part of your personal growth. It's part of your intellectual growth. So yes, any kind of change that you undertake logically should lead to growth.
Currently, you're working on a book which talks about how the Indian military should embrace and learn from the Mahabharata.
Yes.
Can you tell us more about it?
I think it's a well-known fact that a lot of our ancient texts had consistently been neglected, was disregarded because of a certain period in our history where the impact and the influence of Western literature was dominant. I have nothing against Western literature, Western thoughts, Western ideas. There is a system which has evolved over centuries, and their moment of self-discovery, their renaissance was a very important period in world history, and we should have no hesitation in embracing that. So I have absolutely no issues with it. But my issue is with the either or paradigm, that if you are studying Western thought, Western ideas, then anything other than that is not good enough. I feel that there is enough space, be it in our lives or in our minds, to embrace all schools of thought, irrespective of where they come from, till the time they are based on logic, they are based on the richness of the idea. I have no problems in embracing it. So if that be the logic, I think we need to look at indigenous Indian literature, indigenous Indian knowledge, also with an open mind, and not attach any kind of a taboo or any kind of a label to it. While on one hand there is a tendency of certain segments to say that it belongs to a certain culture, religion, certain group of people, on the other hand there is another idea which says that because it belongs to somebody else, I will not read it or I will not embrace it. Both are equally wrong. So the idea with which I began looking at the Mahabharata was that when you look at ancient Indian literature purely from a strategic perspective, the principal text that comes to mind is the Arthashastra. Though Arthashastra became known, read, celebrated relatively later than the Mahabharata, but given the structure of the text, which comes across as a very functional, a to-do kind of a text, in a similar vein as Sun Tzu's Art of War, it finds easier understanding, assimilation, and implementation. However, the very name of the text is related to seeking wealth and power.
Yeah.
Artha that's what it implies. When you look at the four key elements in the quadrangle of how we look at life or the various ways in which we approach life, at the highest pedestal is the idea of moksha, which is salvation. Thereafter comes the idea of dharma, which can be explained in multiple ways. There's no single word which defines it, but for the sake of ease of understanding, it's, let's say, righteousness, morality, all that put into one. Dharma often gets associated with religion. It is actually not as much religion as it is spirituality.
Okay.
Right? Or your duties or your responsibilities. So all this
comes under
the idea of dharma. Then comes the idea of Artha, which is essentially related to generation of wealth, power, etc., etc. And then is Kam, which is desire. So it's Moksha, Dharma, Artha, and Kam.
Calm. What is calm?
Calm, in the very simplest way, is sexuality.
Okay.
So desire emanates from there, which is why I spoke about desire, because that's a wider context of what we're talking about.
Would you call it basic needs and
necessities? Basic needs, yes. Okay. Artha Shastra deals primarily with that element of Artha, which is why I gave this quad, understanding of this quad. And in the hierarchy of these four, Moksha is salvation at the highest level.
Okay.
Thereafter comes Dharma, then comes Artha, and then comes Kam. The Artha Shastra deals with the aspect of Artha. The Mahabharata deals primarily, not only, but primarily with the aspect of Dharma. Yes. So, while we have been celebrating the pursuit of Artha and how to achieve it in the form of statecraft, what a ruler should be doing, which by correlation, if you look at today's context, is how a state needs to be run, and a lot of those things are still relevant today. Either because we haven't worked enough on the Mahabharata, there seems to be a kind of a void that exists in where that Artha must flow from. For me, the Artha is a continuation of the idea of Dharma. It's a subset in many ways of Dharma. It is not something which is seen in isolation or should be seen in isolation.
But ideologically thinking, Artha would come before Dharma, right? So
no, it doesn't. For the simple reason that unless you have your core ideological, philosophical moorings in place, you will not use Artha for the right purposes. Artha is, it's okay. When I gave you that logic of self-improvement and we looked at the why first.
Yeah.
Dharma provides you the why. The what and how is where the Artha comes in.
But psychologically, if you think until your basic needs aren't satisfied, you would not go on the next level. So that's what, before going on the Dharma level, you have to fulfill your...
So that it's a valid point. It's a valid point that you cannot entirely disregard your functional needs. That point, very interestingly, does come up in the Mahabharata as well, and which is why there is a very close interrelation or correlation between Dharma and Artha. So Dharma doesn't operate in isolation. It's even more difficult to attempt to operate Artha in isolation without having your core moral foundation in place.
Your intentions.
Because then it's like, let's earn money, I don't care how. Then that is the logic you follow if Dharma is nowhere in sight. You getting my point?
Okay.
If you do not have the core idea of morality in place, then what possibly a devious person does to earn money can be justified as well. So which is why you must have your core moorings in place, which comes from Dharma, which comes from the entire discourse in the Mahabharata.
So would you say after Mahabharata that you spoke about self-realization?
Yeah.
A scripture such as Bhagavad Gita talks about that?
Yes.
So there is Bhagavad Gita, there's Mahabharata.
So the Bhagavad Gita is an integral part of the Mahabharata. So what happens is that the Bhagavad Gita is essentially looking at the role and the duties of the individual at as its focus, and that happens because of the circumstances in which it plays out, which is on the field of Mahabharata just before the war begins, when Arjun sees his teachers, his brethren, his uncles on the battlefield. He is filled with remorse and he feels that, look, all the slaughter that he is going to undertake, is it really worth the kingdom at the end of it? And that is where the logic of the Bhagavad Gita flows, where he is made to understand that whatever you are seeing is in a way a myth, whether it is relationships, it is life or death, the entire cycle. It's who you see today in its physical form, but that's not really the actual form of that individual. So when you have to perform your duty, which is driven by righteousness, then these relationships should not matter to you, right? So that is the core logic of the Bhagavad Gita, and of course there are various other elements to it, and that's how it gets situated into the Mahabharata. So it is an integral part of the Mahabharata.
So when you speak about Mahabharata, what are the where do you start? Where does the Mahabharata start?
So
and where does it end?
Yeah. So very interestingly, Mahabharata very often is seen as two things. One, the 18-day war, and two, the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita. These are the two most famous, well-known elements of the Mahabharata. For me, the Mahabharata is, if you look at the concept, if you look at war, for example, it's more about the futility of war and the importance of war avoidance and the disastrous impacts of war than it is about the war itself.
Okay.
Because before the war starts, there are any number of attempts that take place at war avoidance. So the core idea remains war avoidance, because what follows thereafter in terms of the war as it happens during the Mahabharata and with the kind of disastrous consequences that it brought in its wake, what you inherit thereafter, you end up asking yourself the question, is it really worth it? And I think that is a far more important takeaway of the Mahabharata than what you do during the war, how do you arrange your forces, what tactics do you use, what weapons do you use. Those are the nitty-gritties of how to fight a war, which is important, of course, from a soldier's perspective. But I think the far greater lesson that you must take away from there is that wars are futile. If you look at the context of the Ukraine war that is going on, there were certain objectives that, let's say, Russia had to begin with. When the war ends, I'm really not too sure if they will be able to justify the achievement of even a fraction of those objectives with the kind of losses that both the sides would have faced. Now, I want to contextualize that by saying that when war is inevitable, you must fight the war to win. There is absolutely no doubt about that. So it's not that when you want to avoid war, you get yourself in such a vulnerable situation in terms of preparedness and capability that you're no longer capable of winning a war. The best way of war avoidance is from a position of strength and not from a position of weakness. Right. So even if you look at the Mahabharata, it was the foolishness of Duryodhan who did not recognize the strength of the opposing side, and despite that went into the war only to be decimated. And everybody else was telling him on their side, all the elders were telling him that, look, this is a disaster in the making, don't do it. And they were convinced, not because merely of goodness, also because they could see the strength of the opposing side. So first logic, first principle, war avoidance. But if you can't avoid in a war, then you must ensure that the war that you fight must be won. And there are any number of instances, both individual and collective, that reinforce that principle in the Mahabharata.
What are the factors that you would say would be there when it comes to war inevitability? When would you say that the war is inevitable? Like, what needs to happen? For instance, sorry to interrupt, someone like Lord Krishna, who is like a purity of soul and purity of energy, even if a person like him is, pushing for a war, there has to be some solid reason.
So first, I think we must correct the perception that he was pushing for a war. He was not pushing for a war. He was the emissary, the eventual and the most important emissary, the diplomat, who was sent by the Pandavas to the court of Dhritarashtra to negotiate settlement. And when he goes there, and the nature of that attempt is brilliant in terms of how he undertakes it, both at the conceptual level and at a very, very practical level. So at a conceptual level, he uses the strategy which again very often tends to get associated only with the Artha Shastra, which is of Sam, Dam, Bhed and Dand. He actually says in the Mahabharata, when he gets back, that I employed all these principles in my attempt to broker some kind of a deal. And in doing so, he tried being nice to them, he tried allurements, so Sam, Dam, he tried dissension, Bhed, and then he tried threatening them. It's said that he also showed his Virat Roop, his actual self, the godly form. He also waters down their demands to such an extent that anyone with even the slightest bit of brains would have accepted it. He said, just give 5 villages to the Pandavas. Take away everything else. Just give 5 villages. Everybody in the court tells Duryodhan, accept it. The deal doesn't get any better than this. Yet he goes about rejecting it, because he says, if I was to give even the slightest of land, it will be seen as my defeat.
Okay.
Right? So he not only intends to stop the war, he also attempts it in all earnest. However, and I think where that sentiment comes from, what I can make out, is that once that negotiation fails, and he had realized, he understood, given the nature of Duryodhan, that the negotiation is unlikely to succeed, which gives the impression that he was looking for a war. But once it was decided that the war was on, then he took it upon himself, the Pandavas took it upon themselves, that they must now win the war. Which is why I said that both things are there. War avoidance, and when war is inevitable, there is no choice but to win it.
So coming back to institutional and individual change and embracing that,
Yeah.
What are the 3 lessons that you learned from the Mahabharata in inculcating in the change, in institutional changes or in individual changes?
There can be many lessons, but let me try and pick 3. So I think the first lesson that I pick is that change must be for the right reason. If change is to seek either personal benefit or that my individual, let's say I'm from the army, and if I am seeking change in the armed forces so that I get a better share for the army, the change is going to be flawed. The larger good is always more important than individual benefit or limited benefits of some part of the organization. That has to be the driving factor for any change. The second is that the individual doesn't matter in terms of that change management process. He is merely an instrumentality who is meant to augment the process of change, assist in the process of change, and if possible benefit the organization in terms of the change that is taking place. If he puts his interest ahead of anything else, it's going to come at a huge cost in the change management process.
So are you trying to say when an individual seeks to change, the reason for his change needs to have a higher purpose?
Yes. So that is the second one. As far as the individual is concerned, it has to be for a higher purpose. If you are seeking, if you're going to the gym and if your only aim is that I must have a good muscular body, I think it's a very, very limited change management process that you're looking at. You're looking at the physicality of the manifestation of that change alone,
Right.
which makes you look better. It's a very short-sighted way of pursuing change.
Well said.
So that cannot be the sole purpose of driving that change. The next element is that any change that takes place cannot merely be led, forced, and guided by an individual. It is always a collective exercise. If you look at the Mahabharata, you have various elements that come together for victory in war. Similarly, in an organization, unless various elements, sometimes even competing elements, come together, they will not be able to ultimately manifest positive change. If the Army, Navy, Air Force, the Ministry of Defence, the Government of India and various other elements of the country do not collectively think about positive change in terms of the structural changes or even in the sense of jointness, improving jointness in the armed forces, this change will not be successful. You'll create the structure, but it will not function to the optimum level.
Right.
Because you will be working at cross purposes. You will not be contributing your best. So change has to be collective. That is, I think, a very important factor that comes in. I think the last part is that the aim of the change should be for its long-term benefit. Any change which is meant merely as a short-term quick fix solution will have very limited value, which means your vision for the change has to be clear. I think these are some of the important lessons that can be drawn.
I'm going to ask you two really personal questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
I want to ask you what would be, since you're speaking about change, what would be one tip to your younger self and how to embrace change?
Stop thinking that you know everything about what you're doing. In our younger selves or in the younger times, we tend to have this feeling that we know exactly what we're doing, or that a subject that I'm reading about or what I'm doing, I know everything about it. It's only with time that you realize that what you saw was a very short, closed element of the whole picture that you were meant to see. In reality, only comes with time, with experience. And if you don't have the experience, you don't have the time, there is no issue at all. There's always scope for consulting. There's always scope for more reading. And that should become the foundation for any self-improvement or any change. It's almost like a reflex action in terms of whatever you do without looking at the bigger picture. So that would be what I would tell myself from the earlier times.
Second question on that lines would be that which book do you think you read a lot, right? So which book would you wish that you would have read earlier?
The Mahabharata.
The Mahabharata.
I wish I had read it earlier, and I think in whichever form you read it, whether it's the abridged version or the complete version, even if you see the serial on television, I've got no problems with that. But I think if you see it with an open mind, or if you read it with an open mind, it has the ingredients, the wherewithal to bring about a profound change in terms of how you look at things.
Lovely, sir. So you have published a few books with Penguin Press. Would you like to share your experience and how your experience was in terms of getting published?
So I think the best part of my interaction with Pentagon Press is, one, I think it's an interactive journey that you undertake with Pentagon Press. It's not as if you have a big publisher who dictates everything, who gives more stress to their own requirements, procedures, gains, rather than the interests of the author. The second is, I think Pentagon Press has always been extremely flexible to meet some fair and some unfair demands that we have placed on them in terms of quality, in terms of add-ons, in terms of timelines. I think in each of these aspects we made some very unfair demands in the past, and I think they have been met. And I think there is a tendency to, most importantly, and that's the last point, to create a sort of friendship and not merely a business association, which is, I think, far more valuable and important for the end product that comes out than merely the transactional part of the association.
Thank you so much, sir. We at Pentagon really appreciate your support and guidance. Before we go, can I request you to sign me a copy for me to keep?
Sure, it'll be a pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Until then, keep reimagining yourself and know that the power of change lies within you.